More liberal Catholics, on the other hand, will see Benedict as a kind of a tragic figure, a man who tried to stand in the way of reforms that were meant to be unleashed by the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, and that they would argue are only now coming to fruition under Pope Francis, Benedict's successor.
Former Pope Benedict XVI undid centuries of tradition when he retired as head of the Roman Catholic Church. The German's resignation in February of 2013, after nearly 8 years as Pope, saw him become the first to do so in 600 years. His death at the age of 95 was announced yesterday. Well, John Allen is the author of 12 books about the Catholic Church. He's written 2 biographies of Pope Benedict XVI and joins us now. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Rick. Glad to be with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you on this New Year's Day. I suppose now the dust has settled, who exactly was former Pope Benedict XVI?
Well, Rick, we can answer that question on 2 levels, can't we? I mean, one, we can talk about the public man, the public figure, the leader. And when we talk about the legacy of a pope, like the legacy of a president or a prime minister, there is no one answer. It's always in the eye of the beholder. I think for more conservative Catholics, Benedict was a hero. He was a man who stood for the truth of Catholic orthodoxy in a time of runaway secularization and moral relativism. More liberal Catholics, on the other hand, will see Benedict as a kind of a tragic figure, a man who tried to stand in the way of reforms that were meant to be unleashed by the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, and that they would argue are only now coming to fruition under Pope Francis, Benedict's successor. Some victims of clerical sexual abuse, Rick, will say that Benedict was the public face of denial and cover-up by the Catholic Church. Others, however, will remember him as the first pope to meet with victims, the first pope to apologize, the first pope to really launch a process of reform. So it is a complicated kaleidoscope. Now, the other level at which we can answer your question, who was Joseph Ratzinger, is the personal level. Now, there, I had the opportunity to get to know Joseph Ratzinger quite well during the 25 years when he was John Paul's right-hand man, and I was with him several times when he was Pope. I can tell you on a private level, I have never met a nicer guy.
Really?
He was the most kind, gentle, humble, self-effacing figure I've ever met, utterly defying the narrative of him as this aloof, commandeering, kind of, draconian authority figure, sort of Darth Vader in a cassock. That was certainly not the man I knew, Rick.
How much do you think the Pope Benedict XVI, still being alive for 9 years after he stood down from the papacy, affected the decisions made by the Roman Catholic Church to where we are today?
Well, Rick, my own sense is that I don't think Benedict's presence in the Vatican, this kind of spectral presence tucked away there in the Mater Ecclesiae monastery, just really a few yards away from the Casa Santa Marta, where Pope Francis has chosen to live. I don't know I don't think it affected the decisions that Pope Francis has made, because obviously, as we all know, Pope Francis has charted quite a different course from that laid out by Pope Benedict. I think what it has done, however, is provide a point of reference, a kind of face for the internal tensions in the Catholic Church. I mean, the reality is that if you are a more conservative or traditional Catholic these days, for the last 9 years, really, your primary point of reference was Pope Benedict, even in retirement. Whereas if you were a more reform-minded, progressive, or liberal Catholic, then you were much more attracted to Pope Francis. And so they sort of came to embody these 2 poles. I mean, despite the fact that the 2 men personally got on very well, and Francis always voiced deep respect and esteem for Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict always voiced obedience and loyalty to Francis. But in the court of Catholic opinion, I think the fact of having a retired pope who embodied a different option for the church could not help but exacerbate the culture wars in Catholicism.
Well, you mentioned the culture wars there, and the Catholic Church is often seen as being behind the cultural times, isn't it? And of course, it still has enormous impact and sway on governmental decisions around the world because of the intertwined nature of church and government in so many states. But how much do you think things are going to change in the immediate future under Pope Francis?
Well, first of all, Rick, I think it's worth saying that you're absolutely right. The Catholic Church is forever behind the times, but I think we should say that is to some extent by design. I mean, the Catholic
Yeah.
Church has this depositive teaching, which is supposed to save it from being swept away by the tides of a particular era's fashions, right? And so some of that is intentional. But look, how much is the Catholic Church going to change under Francis? Well, many would say it has already changed tremendously. I mean, Francis has opened up conversations that have long been considered to be closed, whether it's the question about the role of women in the church and even whether women someday ought to be admitted to the Catholic clergy, whether it's the question about birth control and whether the church ought to someday make its peace with it. And on and on. And so I think a great deal has already changed.
But on those
Pope
issues, there's still
Francis,
so much more, John, isn't there? That's got that
oh, of
really,
course,
many
there's
argue
always
needs to be
going to
done.
be. I mean, I think wherever the world is at a given moment, the Catholic Church is likely to always be at least a century behind it. Again, I say that is to some extent purposeful.
Yeah.
But the pace of change certainly has accelerated under Francis and is likely to continue to do so. I mean, this year he's going to be presiding over a summit of bishops in Rome, the effect of which is likely to broaden considerably the circle of who's involved in making decisions in the Catholic Church, opening up new roles for laity, including women. That's a sea change that could have wide-reaching and potentially vast consequences, Rick.
John, great to speak to you on New Year's Day. Thanks for your time.
Happy New Year to you.
John Allen, the author of 12 books on the Catholic Church, including 2 biographies of Pope Benedict XVI. Fascinating to hear John say, wherever the world is, the church is up to a century behind it. Really nice quote. It's